Okay, I know all the way back in September I said that I was going to be more consistent, and then obviously I haven't been. However, tournament season happened, and that was a little bit interesting. I got the farthest that I have so far, which was pretty great. My debate partner and I actually got to compete at the national championship, which was new and probably one of the most victorious and most fun stories of my life. But another thing happened in that time that is very sad and very unfortunate. I have officially reached the age where I can no longer go to homecoming, prom, or any of those other types of dances. It's something that I always enjoyed and that I always thought was a lot of fun, but now it's time that I start focusing on bigger and better things, right? Like getting a political job, which I'm currently in the process of doing as well. However, there may be a solution that reconciles both of these two interests of mine together: being able to go to dances and having an adult political job. But the Supreme Court is currently trying to get in the way of that. Yes, of course, you may or may not have heard of it by now, but if you have, you probably know what I'm referring to. I'm talking about the White House Ballroom project that Donald Trump has been working on at least since last December when I gave an extemporaneous speech on it. So, obviously, there's a couple of different things going on here. The Supreme Court has decided, according to ABC News on August 7th, a federal appeals court issued a ruling Friday that was blocking the construction of President Trump's $400 million White House ballroom, concluding that congressional approval is needed for the project. Judges Patricia Millett and Bradley Garcia rebuked President Trump for making the unprecedented changes to the historic structure without first consulting Congress. They stated that, quote, each president is a temporary tenant, not the owner of the White House and its executive residence. The president has no and claims no constitutionally assigned authority over that property, end quote. However, this does beg a very significant question. Is Trump actually able to build the White House ballroom? Is there any precedent supporting the idea? And what are the broader impacts of this structure being built? Well, to answer the first question of does Donald Trump actually have the authority to do so, I think that it would be useful to look back at history and see if any other presidents have taken on similar types of projects. This is according to Business Insider in October of 2025, and what I've got in front of me here is a list of different modifications and add-ons to the White House that different presidents, their families, and their staff have made. Starting all the way back in 1857, President James Buchanan's niece, who acted as a first lady, actually had a greenhouse built on the roof of the West Terrace. In 1910, President Theodore Roosevelt added tennis courts behind the West Wing, and William Howard Taft moved them further south. And then the solarium, or the sunroom, was officially built on the third floor in 1927 when President Coolidge was in office. So obviously presidents have done this before, but it's not just those three examples that I actually have to draw on. If we keep going a little bit further down to 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had an indoor swimming pool built in the White House. I didn't even know that they had this. I had no idea that this was a thing. The only indoor swimming pool that I've seen in an older structure before was actually at the Biltmore Estate in, I believe it was North Carolina. But it's pretty fantastic. I had no idea that the White House had one. But I would argue that that's a bigger and a more drastic change than adding on a ballroom. Of course, there's plumbing that goes into it. You have to have some kind of a coating on the walls. There's different things that go into a pool that make it inherently more complex than even adding on an extra room. But additionally to that, President Harry Truman in 1947 authorized a White House bowling alley. Additionally, President Gerald Ford had an outdoor swimming pool built at the White House in 1975. Now, this list goes on and on all the way down to the Obamas adding different things to the gardens and adding different things to the landscaping. But the point is essentially that Donald Trump is not the first person to try to add things onto the White House. I think that the Supreme Court is probably just getting upset at it because, just like about everybody else, they want to be upset because it has President Trump's name on it. He could do one of the most amazing things that the country has ever seen, one of the best policies, but people wouldn't like it just because it has his name on it. Especially, again, when we look back at history and see that multiple presidents have done this before. It's not a question of whether or not the president has the authority to improve the White House or to add something on or to leave it better than they found it, but essentially just does the court system and does Congress agree with the president ideologically? That's the real question that's actually being debated here, especially when we look back at history. But what's the impact of building the ballroom? Does this have any importance, any significance, anything at all whatsoever that we should care about? Well, there are actually a couple of advantages to this. Obama actually talked about this all the way back in his term, stating that he wished that they had some kind of an indoor space to host events so that whenever they wanted to have a gala or some kind of big press event, they wouldn't have to just do it on the lawn. Multiple reporters from multiple different news organizations as well have expressed very similar concerns. The ballroom would allow another place to host events, as well as foreign diplomacy meetings. Now, this is something that we haven't typically had too much to actually do with here. Whenever we have had foreign politicians, diplomats, ministers, etc., when we have had them come, usually the events are done on the lawn. The ballroom would provide another space for us to be able to do this. But I think that it ultimately goes back to the principle of leaving things better than you found it. That's why all of these different presidents have added on to the White House before, because they saw something that could be better, they saw a need or a hole that needed to be filled, and they came up with some way to do it. Just myself personally, I want to have my own property at some point, and I want to make it my project to add on to it as often as I'm able to. Obviously, first comes securing the real estate, then I would like to have a house. After that, I think it'd be fun to build a gym on my property. I think it would be fun to build some kind of maybe a mini movie theater I think could be fun. I would like to have a swimming pool. There's a lot of different ideas that I have floating around. But by taking the White House and doing something very similarly here, just adding on to it to make it better, to improve it, to make it more optimized for the different things that we host and that we try to do with other countries here as well, I think that President Trump is actually making a big improvement to the White House, just as the presidents that we've seen before have done. So, in the end, does he have the authority here, and is the Supreme Court right? I think if we look at history, the first question is very clear. Donald Trump clearly has the authority to do this, as multiple other presidents have done so throughout the decades. And is the Supreme Court right? I don't believe the answer to this is correct. Of course, there is one final concern that we haven't addressed. What about the cost? Because earlier I did mention that this is going to be about $400 million. However, this is a bit of an interesting case as well, because President Trump has made it very clear that he is funding this project himself through revenue from the different businesses that he owns. So finally, the United States federal government is doing something to improve itself without using our money to do so, which I think just makes this even more cool. But yeah, cost isn't actually something that we're all that concerned about either, because it's not even us that's footing the bill. So we're improving the White House, and we're doing it at little to no cost to ourselves. I think that that's a pretty fair project. Additionally, because clearly he does have the ability to do so, I really don't see the problem with it. But I will say I do look forward to potentially using it someday. I can both have my adult political job and potentially go to dances in this ballroom as well.